Geography of Africa has impacted the history of sub-Saharan Africa and how that history has helped shape the culture of sub-Saharan Africa we have today.
And that question is, what does the face of disease look like in sub-Saharan Africa?
Today we will go through a thought-provoking episode on the term Sub-Saharan and the whitewashing of ancient North Africa. Yes, I believe we should address this ongoing attempt to separate North Africa from the so-called Sub-Saharan Africa, as if the Sahara Desert were an inhospitable barrier that no one could cross. This idea that there's a natural, impenetrable boundary starting at the Sahara Desert, that there's no interaction across it, and that everyone with black skin is historically below that line, while everyone above it is somehow magically white, shows a real lack of understanding of how space, geography, mobility, and movement functioned in the ancient world.
No, they were dark skinned, but they were not black. But they are not Negro. Because look at the lips of the...
We really need to stop thinking about this separation, which isn't even an ancient concept. The idea of sub-Saharan is a modern racist trope, that there is a magic dividing line. This notion can be traced back to philosophers like Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the German philosopher, who contributed significantly to racist ideologies about Africa. In his philosophy of history, Hegel dismissed Africa south of the Sahara as a place without history or culture, effectively erasing its significance and reinforcing harmful stereotypes. While Hegel did not specifically coin the term Sub-Saharan Africa, his writings laid the groundwork for such divisive and dismissive concepts. This modern racist concept dates back to thinkers like Hegel and others who sought to create a division between North Africa and the rest of the continent. If you look at someone like Georges Cuvier, one of the early scientists dealing with race around the turn of the 18th to 19th century, he too made distinctions that reinforce these ideas. This notion is persistently problematic, especially since we have early texts that inform us otherwise. For instance, these texts mention Ethiopians and the Garamantes as indigenous to North Africa. The people they referred to as Ethiopians were indigenous to North Africa, yet they are not considered sub-Saharan. I continually wonder about the obsession people have with the term sub-Saharan. Whenever they pose questions, it seems they're trying to prove that sub-Saharan Africans weren't part of the ancient Mediterranean world, which we know is false. We are aware that people we might label as sub-Saharan Africans ruled Egypt before the Persians arrived, among others. They had a continuous culture that extended beyond the Nile and extending to other parts of Greater Africa. Indeed, our ancient sources tell us they firmly believed in and interacted with the area they called Libya. In ancient geography, Herodotus separates the continents, and there was significant geographic debate in the 5th century BCE. On one hand, we have Hecataeus with his map of the world, and Herodotus seems to be addressing and correcting him at various points in his histories. There was debate over whether there was one continent or two, whether everything west of the Nile was its own continent called Libya, or not. Libya is the name used for everything west of Africa, essentially. Herodotus uses Libya, but it's also used at times to refer to the entire continent of what we now call Africa. Remember, Africa is a Roman word, not a Greek one. The Greeks didn't call it Africa. A cautionary note to Western scholars who selectively quote Herodotus. Dr. Henrik Clarke rightly said the following: if you're going to live by Herodotus, you have to accept all that he says. If you're going to cite Herodotus for evidence of one thing, then you have to accept that he says that black people, that is, Ethiopians, in our ancient parlance, are indigenous to North Africa. They're indigenous to Libya, which is his word for basically everything north of the Sahara, because as far as he's concerned, south of the Sahara is uninhabitable. They believed that was an uninhabited zone, too hot for anyone to live there. So you have to understand that our ancient sources were very clear that in that northern part of Africa, that's where Ethiopians lived and were indigenous. That means there were black people there. Additionally, the people we refer to now as either Nubians or Kushites were also called Ethiopians by our Greek sources. They were in ancient Egypt and controlled Egypt. at various times. We actually have a lot of evidence, if you place Egypt into its African context in antiquity, that its orientation is not to the north. It looks to the Nile and to what we would call the south, to the Upper Nile and Upper Egypt. The Egyptians mentioned their origins as being from the Great Lakes region, that is the source of the Nile. The first pharaoh of unified ancient Egypt was from the south, that is Nubia. He was called Narmer or Menes. Also, a prominent pre-dynastic ruler of ancient Egypt, known as the Scorpion King, was also from Nubia. Also, Cheikh Anta Diop pointed out the fact that esteemed priestesses of Amun could only be a Nubian or Sudanese Meroitic. In fact, the cult of Isis was integrated across what we would consider the two separate kingdoms of Egypt and Nubia in antiquity. Their worship of Isis was identical, and they were integrated and connected to each other as early as the 2nd millennium BCE. The idea of Sub-Saharan is a modern racist trope. Georges Cuvier, a French naturalist and zoologist, is often remembered as a key figure in the development of scientific racism during the early 19th century. Around the turn of the 18th to 19th century, Cuvier became infamous for his role in perpetuating pseudoscientific racial theories, particularly through his treatment of Sarah Baartman, a South African woman derogatorily referred to as the Hottentot Venus. After Sarah Baartman's death in 1815, Cuvier acquired her body and subjected it to invasive and dehumanizing examinations. He preserved her skeleton, brain, and genitals for display in the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, reinforcing racial stereotypes through the lens of what was considered scientific inquiry at the time. Cuvier's theories extended beyond individuals like Baartman to encompass entire civilizations. His fascination with ancient Egyptian mummies, which were being unearthed and studied with increasing frequency in the early 19th century, became an avenue for asserting racial hierarchies. He explicitly compared the cranial features of ancient Egyptian mummies with those of Baartman and other African individuals, arguing that these differences indicated separate, immutable races. Cuvier claimed that the shape and structure of the skulls of Egyptian mummies, when juxtaposed with Baartman's remains, provided definitive proof that they belonged to distinctly different racial categories. He suggested that the mummy's cranial features aligned more closely with what he considered superior European characteristics, despite the fact that mummification and centuries of preservation could distort physical features. This selective interpretation ignored evidence of Egypt's deep connections to the African continent. Cuvier's conclusions, however, were not rooted in objective science, but in the biased and Eurocentric framework of his time. By emphasizing perceived anatomical differences between the skulls of mummies and the African bodies he studied, Cuvier sought to reinforce a hierarchical view of humanity that placed Europeans at the top and Africans at the bottom. This misuse of ancient Egyptian artifacts to support racial theories became part of a broader 19th century European effort to appropriate the achievements of ancient Egypt while distancing them from the broader African continent. Cuvier's work laid the groundwork for a legacy of whitewashing, wherein Egypt's ancient civilization was claimed as part of a white Mediterranean lineage, while its connections to Black Africa were systematically erased. Cuvier's work did not exist in isolation, but influenced generations of scientists and intellectuals who perpetuated racial hierarchies through so-called scientific methods. In the 1970s, multinational corporations and global organizations began to use the term Sub-Saharan Africa in marketing and economic reports. This usage often highlighted the region as an emerging market or a zone of investment opportunities, albeit with an undertone of risk and instability. Development agencies and NGOs adopted the term to frame their missions, often perpetuating narratives of crisis and dependency that justified their interventions. So why does this term emerge? It has very little presence before that, and then all of a sudden in the 1960s and 1970s, it starts appearing in various texts. The term Sub-Saharan Africa also became a subtle linguistic tool for racial classification. By implying that everything south of the Sahara was fundamentally different from the north, the term perpetuated a binary of Arab North Africa versus Black Sub-Saharan Africa. This binary erased the historical fluidity of populations, cultures, and trade networks that spanned the Sahara. There's no genetic distinction to be made here. There is no political distinction to be made here in antiquity. According to Western imperialists, all of Africa was a colonial playground until a certain period. Based on their twisted view of African history, they needed to make a distinction between the oil-rich Arab states and the mineral-rich and other resource-rich, exploitable states below the Sahara. I think anybody asking questions about Sub-Saharan and how these ideas apply to the ancient world needs to stop, because they are clearly modern impositions of ideas and ideology, and very recent ones at that. Whenever Western historians say that they want to avoid imposing modern ideologies onto the ancient world, they are referring to aspects of history that favor their twisted view of history. They are, however, okay with imposing modern ideologies onto the ancient world as long as they're modern ideologies, like the category of Sub-Saharan. So I think we need to eliminate this concept when it comes to discussing African history. Whenever this is brought up, the real issue is this: were ancient Egyptians black, or are they white? When we think about the whitewashing of North Africa, some of the loudest voices on the internet wanting to ensure this dividing line between Sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa are people of Arab descent. I'm thinking here specifically of someone like Zahi Hawass, a prominent Egyptian archaeologist and former minister of antiquities, who has been a central figure in the global discourse on ancient Egyptian history.
Nation.
No, they were dark skinned,
But they were not black.
but they are not Negro. Because look at the lips of the Negroes like that and the nose like this. It's not really in the Egyptian origin at all. It's different, completely different. And this is why you cannot connect the Egyptian civilization with the African at all. It's different.
This is a huge lie, not supported by historical evidence. While his work has brought much attention to Egypt's archaeological heritage, his approach to the representation of ancient Egyptians has sparked significant criticism, particularly in the context of whitewashing ancient Egyptian history. Zahi Hawass has often emphasized the idea that ancient Egyptians were not black Africans. He has been known to have said on occasion that ancient Egyptians were not Sub-Saharan African. Hawass has been involved in several high-profile studies aimed at identifying the genetic origins of ancient Egyptians. Notably, a 2017 study conducted on mummies from northern Egypt suggested that the ancient Egyptians were genetically closer to Near Eastern populations than to Sub-Saharan Africans. Critics argue that this study and Hawass's presentation of its findings ignored key variables, including the fact that the sample came from northern Egypt, a region historically influenced by migrations and trade with the Mediterranean and the Near East. This has led to accusations that the study was used to bolster narratives distancing ancient Egypt from its African context. Let's shift our gaze to the United States. Since the early 1900s, people who were called Syrian got to be white. They were categorized technically as white. People from the Middle East are categorized as white because of a racialized law from the early 1900s that categorized them as white. But they don't get to live the experience of being white in America because they're Muslim. It is worth noting that Arabs who have recent access to whiteness, particularly in the United States, but also in the Middle East, where there is severe anti-blackness, want to make the history of ancient Egypt white. They are some of the loudest voices when it comes to this non-scientific and historically inaccurate term known as Sub-Saharan Africa. But it's all this obsession with wanting to participate in this dominant identity group called whiteness, which has no roots in antiquity and has no roots even really in much of modernity. It's really a creature of the US and Europe. So now, white Egypt has taken on a new meaning. Caucasians, Arabs, and others in the so-called Middle and Near East are white. So when they say white, they mean white as in being part of the dominant group. They don't merely refer to the actual skin color. White Egypt refers to all of these groups except blacks living below the Sahara. The Sahara, the largest desert in the world, was once a lush, fertile region teeming with vegetation. Human presence in the area dates back tens of thousands of years. Approximately 70,000 years ago, severe drought transformed the region into an arid desert, a condition that persisted for nearly 60,000 years. At the end of the Ice Age, rains finally returned, reviving the Sahara around 10,000 years ago and transforming it into a savanna. This resurgence of life led to the return of human populations, who thrived amidst the greenery, abundant wildlife, and flourishing agricultural practices. Until 5,000 years ago, the Sahara supported diverse cultures, one of which pioneered the practice of mummification as early as 9,500 years ago. These cultures, together with influences from the African Great Lakes region, contributed to the development of pharaonic civilization in Nubia and Egypt. Around 5,000 years ago, the Sahara experienced another catastrophic drought, and the advancing sands once again rendered the region inhospitable. This forced many of its inhabitants to migrate in search of more habitable areas, while some remained around scarce water sources. Among these resilient populations were black Berber groups, one of which, around 2,500 years ago, gave rise to the Garamantes civilization, a black civilization. The Garamantes, like the majority of the populations inhabiting the Sahara in ancient times, were black Africans. The colonial-era term Sub-Saharan Africa, often used to suggest that black populations only existed south of the Sahara, misrepresents the historical reality of the region. The Garamantes were an indigenous African people, firmly rooted in the black heritage of the continent. A Roman mosaic from the 3rd century CE, found in Utena, a reference to modern Tunisia, supposedly depicts the Garamantes. African-American historian Frank M. Snowden, in Before Color Prejudice, The Ancient View of Blacks, describes the Garamantes as very dark-skinned. Classical writers, such as Lucan, referred to them as perusti, that is, sunburned. Arnobius called them furvy, black swarthy, and Ptolemy described them as moderately black. The Romans, who were often at odds with the Garamantes, frequently expressed their animosity by derogatorily labeling enslaved black individuals as Garamante dung. Despite this hostility, historical sources corroborate the Garamantes' identity as a black African civilization. Professor David Mattingly, an authority on the Garamantes, confirms that the Romans described them as black and emphasizes that they were an indigenous African kingdom. Journalist Peter Beaumont, writing for The Guardian, also identifies the Garamantes as a black African civilization. Moreover, osteological studies have shown that the skeletal remains of the Garamantes bear a close resemblance to populations from further south in Africa. The term Black Africa originated during colonization and was used to describe regions of the continent predominantly inhabited by black populations. While it reflects a demographic reality, it has also shaped perceptions, establishing the idea that so-called white North Africa was always distinct and separate, with black populations confined south of the Sahara. This narrative implies that black people played no significant role in the civilizations of North Africa. This perspective has allowed many to deny the black identity of some of North Africa's greatest civilizations, such as Pharaonic Egypt, Carthage, and Imperial Morocco. The term Black Africa is tied to the concept of Sub-Saharan Africa, an expression propagated by German philosopher Hegel to deliberately exclude black people from the history of North African civilizations. Visual representations support a historical counter-narrative. For instance, the Moors, many of whom were black alongside Arabs, ruled and influenced Spain, Portugal, and Sicily from the 8th to the 15th centuries. Likewise, Libya, often considered part of white North Africa, has historical ties to Black Africa. The region was once the northern part of the Kanem-Bornu Empire and still has a significant indigenous black population. Libya has always straddled the cultural and demographic lines between white and black Africa. The remaining territories of the Maghreb historically maintained this distinction. However, the rediscovery of the black contributions to the Maghreb in the 8th century and the integral role of black populations in building imperial Morocco and Carthaginian civilization bring the Maghreb into the fold of black Africa, at least from a historical perspective. In fact, North Africa, when viewed through the lens of history, emerges as predominantly black. This makes the term Black Africa redundant, or even misleading. Historically, Africa has been culturally and religiously unified through the black identity. While today's demographic diversity might justify the term Black Africa, it fails to acknowledge the continent's historical realities. Even if North Africa is no longer predominantly black, it remains part of the shared memory of the continent. Reclaiming this memory and the significant black contributions to these civilizations is essential for building a collective sense of identity, confidence, and inspiration for the future. To truly embrace Africa's history, the entire continent must be recognized as part of a shared black heritage. Until the lions have their own historians, the tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter.